Playing at Business with Steve Reece, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.
Hi, and welcome to episode 6 of the Playing at Business podcast. I'm your host, Steve Reece, and today we're going to be looking at the symbiotic relationship between movies and toys. Or to put it in musical terms, if love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage, then so do movies and toys. We've seen huge success over the years with toys based on big blockbuster movies. So this podcast episode, we're going to look at this in more detail. So, if you look at the percentage of total toys sold which are licensed, it varies around the world. But it's a very, very significant chunk, maybe between, say, 10 to 20% on average around the world, depending on whose figures you read. So it's clearly a big part of the toy industry, and within those licensed toys, obviously there's some other types of license, traditionally TV-driven, app-driven, but movies is above and beyond in terms of the amount of market share. So, frankly, for sure, if you're a toy company, licensing, it's not always your cup of tea. If you can build and sustain a toy company without licenses, you'll probably be much more profitable. And if you can own your own brands over time, you'll end up with a much more stable business. But nevertheless, one of the key benefits of licensing is, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, easier listings at retail and easier sell through to consumers with less need for marketing push. So when you have a major movie license that clearly is going to adapt reasonably well to toys, you generally don't have to have that real fight to get listings. Maybe you need to fight to get some of the things listed, maybe, but it's an easier path for sure. So, frankly, certainly from my perspective, having worked in various different guises in the toy industry over about 20 years, I can't think of any of the roles I've had where movie licenses haven't been a reasonably significant part of that. So I guess we take that for granted nowadays to some degrees. But I thought it'd be interesting to take a look back at kind of where it all started in pure mass market terms. So generally speaking, although there have been toys based on movies before, they tended to be more like promotional tie-ins before the movie, which kind of really set up and drove huge toy licensing as a standalone thing itself. And that's Star Wars. So when Star Wars was first released in 1977, there hadn't really been anything like Star Wars before in terms of the story, in terms of the setting, in terms of the breadth of characters, all these things. And as rumour has it that at that point in time, the more accomplished actor involved, Alec Guinness, wasn't so keen. So he was offered a slice of kind of the after revenue, if you like, the merchandise and so on, which, to the movie execs at the time would have seemed like, a few percentage points off a few hundred or a few thousand t-shirts. But since 1977, Star Wars is generally reported to have sold more than $30 billion of merchandise, and toys is a very significant chunk of that. And, I remember when I first joined the toy industry, Star Wars was still a top-selling brand, despite there having been no movies for well over a decade. For a brand that kind of launched in the 70s based on a movie to still be shifting toys based on that franchise with no huge amount of activity, programming or content, all that time later, nearly 20 years later, is quite outstanding. And in fact, I don't tell this story very often, but one of my own really golden memories of toys was the huge attraction of the Star Wars toys. So, I remember them so well. So many other people will tell similar stories. The characters had a small hole in the base, and we all used to wonder why that was until we found the one friend who was fortunate enough to have been given the full play set, and there were some glass stands which would actually stand the characters up. Nowadays you would just presume they need to be able to stand up, but I guess things were newer back then. And I remember walking through a Toys R Us back in some point in the early 80s with my mother desperately trying to beg for some Star Wars figures, but basically they were too expensive at the time for our budget. And then I remember about 3 years later when I'd kind of moved on from that age of toys, but buying a complete set in a jumble sale for a few pounds, and finding that hugely exciting, because all those things I'd really wanted a few years before were completely out of my reach. Either they were sold out in retail or they were just too expensive for the household budget at the time. So my own personal experience of toys actually in some ways kind of starts with Star Wars. So how to capture a whole generation of kids and to drive a 30-year plus toy franchise off the back of it, quite amazing really. I think one of the other things which I would point out though about the movie world is we often think that it should be easy to work out what's going to be a huge success and what isn't, but obviously things don't always work that way, and it would be remiss of me to talk about movies and toys without mentioning a couple of the massive surprise success stories. So I mean, this sounds, as I'm considering this now, this sounds so ludicrous it's ridiculous, but the original Toy Story movie back in the 90s, it turned out to be a massive hit, both as a movie and even more so as a toy brand. In fact, it was so successful as a toy brand that the merchandise was very quickly sold out and hugely under forecast. And as we know, it takes quite a long time to upweight forecasts, to get retail buy-in, to place orders with China, for China to manufacture, to change tooling if they need upgrade tooling, to manufacture and then to ship, and then for us to distribute out to the stores. It's a matter of months. So there was a huge clamour for Toy Story toys, which obviously we're all here with the benefit of hindsight saying, well, that's just ridiculous. But nobody really understood the technology. We didn't know what to expect from that new technology that was used for the production of Toy Story at the time, which we kind of would now take for granted, that type of 3D. But at the time, we just didn't know, and so rather embarrassingly, the toys were so undersold that they even put a reference to it in one of the later movies. I remember sitting there as a paid-up member of the toy industry whilst the movie made fun of those movie execs who hadn't expected the toys to sell first time round. On a similar note, actually, the Frozen movie a couple of years back proved to be a phenomenal hit, both as a movie and as a toy brand, but unexpectedly so. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to preview many movies, and sometimes you get a feeling, sometimes you just know, and sometimes you're not sure. And obviously the general sense for Frozen must have been that people weren't sure quite what to expect. But it was a massive hit in the end, and funny enough, I was actually called onto radio to justify on behalf of the toy industry. Not that I claim to have a remit on behalf of the toy industry, but just as someone interested in the toy industry, I thought I would defend the industry on radio. And they pitched me against an angry parent who couldn't get Frozen toys, and it was all supposedly just a scheme to increase sales, and all that kind of stuff, which, as any toy industry person will tell you, is complete rubbish. We want to sell as much as we can on movies and licenses whilst the heat is hottest. So even nowadays in this sophisticated world of forecasting and movie green light processes and all that kind of stuff, Frozen was an unexpected hit. And then fast forward even further into this year, 2018, Black Panther has been a massive surprise movie hit and also a toy success as well. And that's despite a very unfashionable release date in February. Now, there's all kinds of stuff behind the Black Panther movie, and I guess why it may have been under anticipated, and the success may have been underestimated, and some of those are very contentious. So I'm not going to go into those now. But the reality is, despite all the people, despite all the budgets, despite all the combined expertise of the licensing world, both toys and non-toys, and also the movie studios, we sometimes just don't know when a movie's going to be a hit. And oftentimes the thing that really moves the needle in terms of the overall toy market size are those surprise hits. And so oftentimes when you go back and the toy industry's gone down a few percent or it stayed static, those years which have made the difference, there normally are one or two major movies that you can really point to that have added that 3 to 5% of growth. So the next section in this podcast, I often use a phrase which doesn't really make sense. I don't think it's in the dictionary, which is toyetic. I don't think I invented this. I'm pretty sure I heard colleagues speaking about this many moons back. So apologies if I'm falsely claiming anything here. But this word toyetic is really important in the sense that it summarises, something which is likely to lead well to toys. It's likely to convert well to toys. It's likely to lead to toys that sell in good quantities. So one of the big questions I always ask is this movie toyetic? Can you obviously transfer the characters in this movie and turn them into a successful toy range? So, I mean, when I'm doing consulting work, this is obviously one of the major themes when people are originating content, is that they sometimes miss one of the most obvious kind of areas or categories that you need. If you miss a category of toys worth 10 to 15%, maybe you're not going to get a master toy licensee. Maybe you're going to have to settle with a collection of smaller licensees, which may or may not be the aspiration. So just for example, if you're developing this kind of product, if you want to have a movie which is a hit in the toy aisle, you better include some kind of vehicles, some kind of mobility machine, something that the characters can get around in. The characters themselves, generally speaking, you probably want to have a reasonably broad character matrix. And you want to have different types of characters in there. So you maybe want some soft and fluffy characters, which would lean more easily towards plush toys, for instance. Maybe you'd want some more hard and aggressive toys, which plays to the traditional. It's debatable whether that's a modern day stereotype, but the traditional stereotype for boys, certainly in some countries, that definitely still applies. But regardless of gender, some kids like soft and fluffy, some kids like hard and aggressive. So, some people say why label on gender, and I guess there's some sense in that. But the reality is, if you have a character matrix which is very, very simple, and where it has very similar types of characters, you're going to find it harder to have a broad toy line. Also, you're going to want some physical environments for the characters to be in, which are iconic, which are inspiring, and which are going to be easy to make out of injection molded plastic in a factory in China or India or somewhere. So actually, the classic example, again, to go back to Star Wars as an example, one of the main reasons for the enduring appeal of Star Wars in the toy aisle, to my view, is clearly the vast array of all those things I've just mentioned. So, there's a huge array of characters. You've got good and bad, which is a kind of a perennial theme. You have a collection of heroes. You've got kind of, even if you go back to the original movie, you had the kind of the young and plucky one in Luke. You had the sort of older, wiser, more sarcastic one, maybe a bit more macho one in Han Solo. You had a sassy female character in Princess Leia. You had the ultra baddie in Darth Vader. And, a whole host of other kind of mascots and icons throughout. And I guess in the end, the ultimate mascot would be the Ewoks, as per Return of the Jedi. So Star Wars is just amazing, and oftentimes when I watch that film, you'll see a scene like in the hangar of the Death Star, and you just look at the array of different types of space craft, the different types of uniforms and kind of space armor, the different blasters and saber weapons. It's almost like as if it was designed to be the most toyetic movie of franchise of all time, which is why, lo and behold, it's one of the most successful toy franchises of all time. So, I think the next thing to look at is what you'd call the metrics. So box office takings, and also the kind of the whole sequels versus toy sales thing. So, I guess the first thing is to say that certainly in this day and age, a movie which is kind of mass market entertainment, as opposed to being kind of purely an animated feature primarily for kids, but like a family blockbuster type movie, will need to be doing more than say $400 million worldwide to be seen as being a box office reasonable performer, and and to really drive significant toy sales and not to leave excess inventory on shelves. Now obviously there are various examples where that needle's moved above $1 billion, and those tend to be lo and behold the movies that drive ridiculous levels of toy sales. But I think the other thing to look at, actually, it's something to take really a really hard look at if you're a toy company, is the whole kind of sequel and prequel model. Now, obviously, if we look at movies as a business, it's a huge risk to make a new movie. The budget may be anywhere from, for a blockbuster movie, anywhere between 100 million, if you're very lucky, to 200, 300 million dollars. So obviously you need to be as sure as you can that it's going to perform at the box office, and it's going to perform in terms of what you'd call ancillary revenue, so licensing and toys being part of the licensing revenue. And so obviously, in a way, bearing in mind the world is generally, when it comes to spending huge amounts of money, run by accountants, and kind of corporate management who are accountable to the stock market at the end of the day in a lot of cases. It's obviously sometimes seen to be less risky for studios to develop a sequel or a prequel at those great expense levels on a proven franchise, versus investing at pretty much 100% risk into another fresh franchise. So actually, the classic example in the last kind of decade to 2 decades is the X-Men franchise. So far, I think if my research is right, 11 movies released to date at the time of recording, and box office takings. Obviously, inflation has an impact here, but somewhere in the region of 300 million to say 750 million dollars worldwide. So you're looking at kind of 5 billion plus at the global box office over the space of a decade or two, which is just huge. And also mirroring that kind of consistency of box office performance, X-Men's become a major ongoing toy franchise, and a major ongoing feature of toy aisles in kind of stores around the world of all kinds, in the mass market retailers and the toy specialist. And I guess frankly, the practical benefit of having sequels and prequels is if the stock doesn't clear through on the movie and DVD releases, sometimes it'll sell through when the next sequel or prequel comes around, and some old stock in the back will find its way onto shelf. Kind of the major issue, though, the major challenge with the whole sequel prequel model is what happens when an installment disappoints. Does that mean that franchise is effectively dead? Does it mean it needs to have a quieter couple of years before it can be brought back? Probably, frankly, the latter more than anything. But if you have a major toyetic movie like an X-Men, Transformers movie, a Star Wars movie, and it doesn't perform, and it leaves stock sat on shelf, that can to a degree damage the franchise in retail, which is obviously a really bad thing all around. So this is kind of like the biggest ongoing issue at the moment, is that the sequel prequel model is so proven overall, but the risk is what happens when one of them doesn't work. But hey, there you go. So I think the next section I wanted to talk about in this podcast was to look at Disney Corporation. Now, when I entered toys, Disney was probably the major corporate player in toy licensing, and I had some very happy dealings with them and made some amazing products with them. But since then, obviously they've been on the acquisition trail, and I think one of the impacts of them buying up so many other studios, especially studios producing classic toyetic movies, is a more balanced movie slate. So we used to get what you'd call fallow years without strong movies, where perhaps there would have just been something really strong the year before, so the stock would still be selling through retail, but all the anniversaries were poor around those movie kind of yearly anniversaries in terms of sell-through. Maybe retailers didn't put quite as much shelf space behind the toy category because of that. Those toy companies that had really big movie licenses one year but not the next would probably have quite significant restructures to reduce overhead, which is obviously painful in many ways. So I think one of the huge changes in the last 10 years, say, is that by Disney acquiring 10 years overall as a kind of a process, roughly speaking, Disney have really helped to balance out that slate. And if anything, perhaps we've got a little bit too frequent, and there has been some debate and argument over things like the Star Wars spin-off movies, for example. Do we really need a Star Wars movie every year? I mean, obviously we'd all like one, as it's such a successful toy franchise, but obviously we need it to work. Obviously Disney need it to work as well. So that's quite a topic of conversation at the moment. But if you just look at what Disney have acquired, they acquired Pixar in 2006, having been the kind of the distribution partner for Pixar since conception. The movies which have come out of Pixar have just been amazing. Both in terms of creative, not that I'm necessarily qualified to judge that, but certainly in terms of reviews and kind of audience feedback, but also commercially. It's been just an amazing success story. The acquisition of Marvel in 2009 by Disney gave them a huge position in superhero movies and action figure type toys, and then obviously Lucasfilm and Star Wars in 2012, which is as good a business as you're going to acquire, I think, in toys. So going forward, it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of slate is managed to ensure that each franchise gets some kind of time off to keep things fresh. And I think I think one of the big things for Disney maybe to have a look at, although I'm sure they don't heed my advice judging by their share price growth over the course of the last 20 years. But if you look at Pixar, they've just relaunched the Incredibles franchise with Incredibles 2, and it's partly, I guess, because of the development capacity of the studio. They want to do some new projects, launch some new franchises. By the time they have perhaps slots to bring back the next one, it's been a while. But the Incredibles 2 launched well over a decade ago, and was definitely by all accounts successful. So the fact that it's taken so long to bring that back, perhaps there's something we can all learn there. I'm a huge fan of the balanced movie slate. I guess the question is, do you get to saturation point, and how do you keep those sequels and prequels fresh? That's going to be a big kind of question and challenge for the future. But generally, I think the toy industry is in a good position because of all those acquisitions and the movie and toy tie-in. I think in conclusion, but also to kind of take a look forward, if I can get my crystal ball out, I think one of the major challenges for the movie industry, for the TV industry, and for the toy industry is the huge shift, the kind of seismic shift of viewing from kind of formally produced, formally distributed entertainment to more informal YouTube style content. Kids now will spend as long looking at clips of, if it's a kid is into soccer, they'll be looking at soccer. If it's a kid that's into gymnastics, they'll be looking at gymnastics, or they might be just looking at YouTube vloggers' general output. So there is some kind of threat taking shape here, and so in a sense, to balance out my comments about frequency, in a way we almost have to be frequent in order to kind of combat this ongoing content viewing and production from these YouTubers nowadays. I guess the counter argument would be that movie viewing is kind of a different occasion. It's it's a different need state, if you like. So classically during holidays, when parents are desperate to occupy the kids, that's a classic time for movie visiting, and that's often when the really big movies launch. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. I guess the reality is the YouTube content revolution is, historically speaking, if we take that kind of perspective, it's probably still in its early stages. So I think the shift is going to continue, and that's a major challenge to movie studios. And movie marketing has always been a massive noise creator in a short period of time, and that's definitely going to have to continue. And I guess the one thing you would say is that the cult of personality has only been exemplified by the rise of social media and YouTube. So I guess in a way the age-old movie marketing models are still likely to work. So that's about it for today's episode of the podcast. I've been your host, Steve Reece, and as ever, if you have any topics you'd like us to cover, please do get in touch. You can get in touch with us via the podcast website, which is www.playingatbusiness.com. In case you wondered what I do for a day job, we run a toy business consultancy, offering general consultancy, product representation and sourcing. We help people to find factories effectively. So if you're interested in some of those services, you can find out more about what we do there at www.kidsbrandinsight.com, or just search Steve Reece Toys online and you'll find some kind of reference to what we do. And please keep listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, and bye.
Playing at Business with Steve Reece, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.